So as always, Ben Christinet, and welcome back to the Peace Chapel this morning. It's good to have you. I'll go ahead and call up our opening prayer. Let's just take a moment this morning and bring ourselves to that place, that center, where Christ awaits us. That sacred gaze of welcome, of love, of joy. The opening prayer today will conclude our prayer to that we've been using for the last several weeks, which is the Lorca of St. Patrick, or I should say our closing prayer will finally bring that to a close. So let us pray. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in the eye that sees me, Christ in the ear that hears me. So our first reading today spans 98 to 99, comes from chapter 4. And we're moving into a section now that in my book I call Renegades and Parasites, which are metaphorical ways of looking at the two types of so-called demons that assail us. If the ancients understood demonic forces with more sophistication than their depictions suggest, we might ask, conversely, whether in a more psychologically astute culture, there is ongoing value in speaking of our demons at all. It seems to me there is. Whether figuratively or literally, until we are able to name our demons, we are unable to excise them. The effect is the same. We know, for example, that for those committed to 12-step programs, the naming of demons is a way of life from which all of us could profit. In such circles, it is customary to introduce oneself by first name, accompanied with the public acknowledgement that, quote, I am an alcoholic, an addict, and so on. Naming a demon is the first step to gaining control over it. And the same psychology is reflected in the Christian rite of exorcism, which requires the priest to compel the possessing demon to reveal its name. Regardless of what we might make of exorcisms theologically, there is a psychological insight worthy of our attention. The shadow side of ourselves must be named if we are ever to be liberated from its dominance. There is as much an ethical as there is a spiritual urgency to this liberation. To the extent that we remain oppressed by our demons, we also remain complicit in the harm they cause others. Thus, despite the many ways our demons oppress us, it may be helpful to characterize them as two types, the renegades and the parasites. In general, renegades are crude and self-destructive, while parasites are more subtle, but ultimately more dangerous. I will take each in turn. Amen. So continuing on page 99. The renegades consume us like spiritual cancers, unskilled and bent on our destruction, usually emerging from the cracks of unhealed psychological wounds, emotional trauma, or addictive tendencies. The havoc they wreak is most often quite evident for the world to see. Lives destroyed by substance abuse, sex addiction, rage, greed, and compulsive patterns of behavior that all but destroy one's capacity to live integrated, productive, and meaningful lives. Like renegade teenagers, they tap into our most base adolescent impulses, demanding instant gratification and stunting our capacity to mature into the more sublime joys of emotional and spiritual adulthood. Let us pray. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through a belief in the threeness, through a confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. Amen. Okay. So you have the floor. Thoughts, questions, responses, comments. Hi there, Gail. Good morning. You want to go ahead and unmute, okay? There you go.
First of all, this is the first time that I've ever shared in this group, and I've been with you for most mornings for at least a year and a half. And I want to thank all of you for the wisdom and your vulnerability, the things that you share that have been so helpful to me. These two paragraphs just, the beautiful way that they express, I guess, what I see, what I think of as the power of things that are not brought into the light. I mean, the things that we know deep within our souls, of our own frailties and sin. And yet these two paragraphs, to me, they help me understand how oppressive not naming them and bringing them, that actually we're bringing them to the light, where we can, with the help of our generous and loving and forgiving God, free ourselves from the power of them in our lives. So I want to thank you for these two paragraphs. They're just so, to me, so rich and I think about Paul, and he talks about the principalities, but it's like something that is out, that can be outside of ourselves. So I thank you, Father, for that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, so thanks, Gail, and thank you for your comments today. And it's nice to have had you. I certainly recognize you as a member here. Just some quick comments. The next several pages, which for us probably means the next couple of months or so, we'll be exploring these sort of renegades and parasites together, and to look at how different they are. And I begin with the so-called renegades, because I do think ultimately we'll discover the parasites are by far the more dangerous of the two, precisely because, like a good parasite, they learn to live with their host unnoticed. It's only the poorly developed parasite that kills off the host, but the shrewd parasite knows how to live unnoticed and therefore continue to thrive. And so we're going to see how the renegades, so to speak, really are those things that are very overtly destructive and really could take a person down for all the world to see. Whereas and that's what I mean to say that they grow out of our psychological woundedness, our unmet needs, right? Our desire for good, really, affection and love, and where we feel deprived of that, things can get warped, right? We find desperate ways to strive for those things. Whereas, as we'll see, the parasites don't, I think, as I'm trying to discuss it, don't grow out of our woundedness, but more out of our complacency, where the status quo is serving us well, and we prefer just to keep it that way, and don't want to upset any apple carts by addressing the way that I'm complicit in a world that is unjust, or so forth and so on. So I do think it's a rich chapter, but you pointed to something that really underlies all of what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. One of the reservations I've had about reading this chapter at such a slow pace is that it's going to, drag on what is relatively a dark chapter. I mean, really an exploration of our dark side, our shadow side, the so-called demons, and that could feel like this very long, protracted exploration in the venue that we're doing it. But what I think is important to kind of reiterate over and again as we're doing this is the fundamental optimism that lies beneath our capacity to do this work. And you pointed to it in your comments. That is, we do this before God, who is loving and who receives us, and who I would even say desires for us this inner strength and trust in that divine love to do this work of introspection and examination of conscience, to use a more traditional term, but to really look at that because we have the trust that the work is being done, not as I've mentioned in other places, as if we are sinners in the hands of an angry God, but as if we are beloved children for whom God seeks our liberation, and indeed whom Christ came to liberate us quite precisely from these sorts of oppressive forces. So I just appreciate your pointing to that relational quality. And I would ask for us to hold that as we do this exploration, that is the underlying optimism of all of this dark exploration, that this is a loving God who rushes out, as I've said in previous chapters, to greet us along the journey.
Father,
Yes.
I would like to talk about the demons that I have witnessed in a prayer meeting years ago. So demons are real, and I will always remember that experience. It was this team of in the prayer group that were praying over this woman, and she had glassy eyes and she just looked terrible. And they were praying over her, And we heard a lot of noise as we walked by, and then we listened. They were praying, and because she had, there were several demons that were within her, and they prayed until each of them came out, and the experience was really terrible, because she would gulp and she had foam in her mouth, and then all of a sudden another gulp, a demon left, and then she'd be a little quiet. They'd pray some more, and they prayed for a long time. And after it was all over, she was a completely different person. She was so serene, and she was a new woman. And following that, we went right into a service. There was mass, and there was such praise and jubilation. So that was my experience that I witnessed of demons, and they are real. I'll never forget that experience. And I thought I would just share it this morning, since we're talking about demons. Thank you, Father.
Well, thank you, Rosemarie. I'm delighted to hear that at the end of that sort of ordeal, that she came away from that experience
Yes.
much more serene.
Yes.
It's a beautiful account. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Other thoughts? Hi, Vinny. Good morning.
Good morning. So my question is, when do we move away from naming our demons to moving into our new creation? When does Jacob become Israel, Saul become Paul, Simon become Cephas? When can we move away from the identity of the demon to the identity of the new creation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think even in all of the examples that you just named, I think in some ways it does point, as is often the case in the spiritual life, not to a linear journey, but one that really is more circular. So, for example, even after Saul adopts the name Paul, which, by the way, he does because Paul is simply the Greek version of the name Saul. So a lot of folks are under the impression that he had some radical name change to signify his new vocation. It really was more, as he went out to the Gentiles, he used a name that would be more readily acknowledged or understood by them. Sort of like if I was, becoming a missionary in Mexico, I would call myself Vicente or something. It more has that kind of sense to it. But but nevertheless, it does to some degree acknowledge certainly a new phase and vocation in his life. But even after that so-called Damascus experience, he prays repeatedly for God to remove this thorn in his side, that famous "my grace is enough for you" response. Or Jacob, continues to falter in his life and so on. The encouraging news there is that I think in some ways grappling with our demons is the stuff of the spiritual life. It is a perpetual need to look to those potential ways in which those shadows rise up in us, to be vigilant about them, and to consistently sort of learn to overcome them. That said, I do think that, like so much both in the physical world and spiritual world, we do become more adept at it with practice. And the example I've given before of how Athanasius tells the story of the life of Antony, the first desert ascetic and monk, and he describes his own nightly battling, which is first quite, a lot of, he gets beat up a lot, and he comes out of every morning from his cell bruised and battered. That over time, as he sort of builds into his spiritual life and becomes a more spiritual master, the demons assail him, but don't fight him, because he pretty much is able to keep them at bay by saying, look, you really don't want to do this again, because you know how this will end. And, they reach the point where they say, well, you're right. And so we're going to go pick on someone who's a little weaker and who's a little more vulnerable, because he kind of does reach a place where it's not that he isn't assailed, but more that he's gotten too big for them to bother. So they prey on easier prey. So I think it's a both and. I think that we do develop within the spiritual life, and that I suspect for many of you, this is already happening. It's hard to dedicate yourself to some degree of silence without this stuff coming up, without an authentic way in which these things arise in us. And yet I hardly know a person who I can say from their perspective has told me, yep, I've overcome all this. So again, one of the pieces to this that is going to be very important is how we understand the ascetical life, the life of asceticism, as really the battle. In the Philokalia, which is the Eastern Orthodox collection of teaching around the Jesus prayer and what they call watchfulness, that indeed is watchfulness is what we're talking about as asceticism. It is that vigilant watchfulness of thoughts, ideas, what they call logismoi, those sort of pesky thoughts, ideas, temptations, emotions, resentments, regrets, anxieties that come up in us during prayer, that really are the forces that want to hold us back from moving into what they would call Hezekiah, or that deep tranquility that we arrive at. And so what I think is probably the experience for many of you, these moments of Hezekiah or inner stillness or tranquility do rise up in us, and we have moments of respite. And yet, once again, we're assailed with depression or ennui or anxiety or whatever the case may be. The beauty of the ascetical life is that we come to recognize that our failure to overcome these demons, as it were, is God's victory in us. And the point of the ascetical life is not that we become independently able to fend off these wounds or brokenness or demons, but that we discover ever more so our deeper and deeper reliance on the divine. And so the intensity of intimacy actually is enhanced by us doing this watchful, vigilant work of asceticism, rather than we become independent from God and become superheroes who can kind of do it on our own. We're really driven to a point where we realize our need, our dependency on God. These types of paradigms are expressed archetypally in the whole struggle of Israel with God throughout its history, where, God continues to say, hey, look, you're dealing with the social demons of injustice and, greed and all of this. And the way that gets spelled out in the history of a nation is, they get overcome by an enemy and driven out into the desert again. And then the question is, why are we here? I thought, God was with us. And they realize this is not a punitive action on God's part, but one in which it's a calling Israel back to the desert for a deeper, you want to say, a purification again, to remember that these shackles of society and attachments and all that comes with that can blind us from this continual need of dependence on God. And Israel is led ever more, where God says, I will woo you again by bringing you into the desert. And there's a sense in which that story becomes played out over and over again in our own interior lives. We're being wooed back to the desert. It can feel harsh, it can feel punitive, but what it is that those purifying graces that drive us back to more intimate relationship with God. So it's definitely, I think, not linear, it's cyclical. But like I often say, I think rather than just think of yourself as going in a circle like a Ferris wheel or a ferret sort of cage, it's like a spiral staircase. With each time we come full circle, we're not quite in the same place. However you want to imagine, we're up a level to newer heights or deeper to deeper depths. But in any case, we come full circle, not in the same place, but somehow moved and transformed in the process. So there is movement happening in either deeper or higher, however you'd like to imagine that. But I also think that here we are again. I'm dealing with this again, but in a new way. Yeah. I don't know if that resonates, Vinny, with your own experience, but that's how I have experienced it. Thank you. Christine, please.
Now, a picture that comes to me as you're talking is that of fireflies dancing in the dark. That as we see our demon and name it, the energetic involved in that produces light, and we shine for an instant. And we see one another shining in the dark, and that encourages us. So as each of us share the demons that we struggle with, we shine, and others are encouraged by it. It's the most beautiful dancing in the dark until the dawn comes and we're all dancing in the light. So
Yeah,
I-
that's a, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Christine.
that just encourages me so much to see everyone dancing in the dark together.
One of the powerful things that I think you're speaking to is the way in which the shame we carry around our demons is what keeps them alive, precisely because we refuse to address them. We brush them under a rug, and at the and the most terrifying thing is to share it with another person or another group. But, you know, as I continue to try to foster what I call, you know, a spiritually intimate community, that's the stuff of bringing us to a place where gossip about another person, judgment about another person, all falls apart because you realize there's nary a thing you can accuse somebody else of that you haven't on some level been a part of in your own life. And once we can start, if you want to speak of what the demons hate, it's the honesty and authenticity and openness. You know, all of this stuff driven by shame is what keeps us each in the dark, pretending that we can sort of get by without acknowledging, right, these aspects of ourselves that's petty or greedy or power hungry or whatever it is. But when we share it, that dance of light you're talking about lights the way for someone else to be able to say, I thought I was the only one. Or if they can admit to this particular thing they struggle with, then surely I can. And then that bulwark or that fortress of privacy, of hiding, because we're all so ashamed to acknowledge it, begins to crumble. And what you have is the exposure of the fact that, yeah, we all are really struggling, and very often with similar things. And as I said earlier, if the demon has a different face, you just follow the contours and it's all the same tale. We just all get, if you want to say, struck at our Achilles heel. And that's why understanding this notion of renegades as coming out of our woundedness, that's what determines the face of the way the demons will appear to you. If your woundedness is abandonment or being neglected, then it's going to come out in broken ways through that anxiety or fear or trauma. If your woundedness is something else entirely, then the face is going to address that. But in doing that, we realize we're all grappling with the same beast, as it were. And that's the beautiful thing. So indeed, our grappling individually becomes a light on the path for others to follow. And the worst thing that religion can do is to be the place where, how many churches are you aware of or have you been a part of where the expectation is that you walk in the door and you have to then put on a facade of holiness, of righteousness, of being a good Christian, and that is the institutional expectation? Nothing gets transformed in that context. Everybody's just pretending. So, but yet so many religious contexts and parishes have that as its unspoken sort of assumption. And all that does is drive us deeper into our isolation, and it becomes part of the problem, not the solution. Yeah. So the first thing the church and the communities of the church have to do is to stop judging or giving the appearance of judgment, and rather invite openness so that we can all recognize where we stand, you know, and that we all stand. Nobody has a high horse to ride in on, that's for sure. Much less the priest at the pulpit who's trying to encourage a congregation to live authentically. If we can't admit publicly to our congregation, here's where I screw up, here's where I doubt, here's where I'm afraid, here's where my faults are. All these ways are just honest ways of saying, you know, I'm not pretending to be holy, or I'm trying to guide us or hold a space for us. That's a very important thing. And I think too often priests themselves feel pressured to not expose those for fear that their congregation will sort of lose hope or lose respect. But I think the truth is quite the opposite. Okay, sorry, I'm just lost track of so let's say, Mary, please. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm going to go back to a phrase that Vinny used, which was new creation. And when we became believers, we became a new creation with a new heart. And that is our identity. That's who we are. And I think reminding ourselves of that yes, you want to acknowledge and recognize the demons, but that is not who I am. I am still a child of God. I'm still a new creation. And that kind of helps, I think, in when you remind yourself of that, then you can have that awareness. You can have that separateness from the demon and call it for what it is. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you. It's a beautiful perspective. And I think, Mary, you're pointing to that sense of optimism. I had a monk friend who told me every day that we wake up, we are born again, born anew. We are a new creation. Just with the day, as the day symbolizes the dawn of creation, so too we sort of wake up with that original innocence, right, of Adam and Eve, of that what we call the Edenic innocence, the innocence of Eden, and to remember that that is constitutive of our deepest identity, new creations. And then whatever happens throughout the day, by the end of it, to be able to simply acknowledge, where am I in that? Where are my weaknesses? Where have my demons come up again? And that simple acknowledgement before we rest again in sleep in the hands of a loving God, and then to be recreated and brought again to a new creation. So that whole cycle of the day, the week, the year becomes cyclical and deeply tied to our own spiritual journeys, the way we celebrate that liturgically, but it all speaks to this ongoing regenerative sense in which we're always a new creation in Christ. It's beautifully said. Thank you. Carol, please. Good morning.
Thank you, Father. I'm sitting here just full of gratitude for everything that I'm hearing, because what I'm grateful for is that I have been for many years a very active member of a 12-step community. And that is so much of what you're speaking about. The founders of Alcoholics Anonymous based their program on spirituality, on believing that I can't do it myself. There is a power greater than me. There are no requirements to belong to any kind of religious congregation, although many people do. It's just believing that I can't do it without God, and that we in those rooms have the most intimate of communities where people share their deep, dark secrets.
Right.
And there are always others who identify. And when I do that, I always think I'm alone. I'm the only one. I'm the only one. As soon as I open my mouth and get the courage to do that, it happens. The demon is out. I'm free. I'm liberated. I'm not the only one. But until I can express it, I'm still bound to it. There's a saying in 12-step rooms, we're as sick as our secrets. And that's very much along the same lines as what you're saying. Until we expose it and put it out in the light, like Christine, then we're still living in the dark. So I'm so grateful that I'm here and that I'm getting such confirmation that the 12-step recovery program is truly a way out. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I really appreciate that connection, which you saw I alluded to in my paragraphs today. I always joke that if I were czar of the universe, everybody would have to do the 12-step program. But really the case is that this is what should be happening in our congregations. in any case, right? This really, because what the 12-step program puts forward is a spiritual program for doing that work of exposing the secrets that keep us sick, that keep us unhealthy in various ways. And if one could speak to the fortune of those who struggle with various addictions for whom there are 12-step programs, there's actually an advantage there than for those who struggle with types of demons that for which there are no 12-step programs created. And the reality is this should be the way our churches help people come to this deep contemplative practice of what we're talking about in this chapter as asceticism. It is shocking and beautiful how when we read the sort of pithy sayings and teachings of the desert mothers and fathers, how much of this they understood, how in such a primitive context, we're talking 4th century, how much they got about the human psyche and how much they understood community and the value of silence. Their silence, for example, was not merely the silence of, a contemplative silence. It was also because they understood how easily words can tear communities apart through backstabbing, gossip, exaggeration, lies, finger pointing, judgment. They chose their words very, very carefully and chose not to speak precisely to help maintain a healthier community because they understood the danger of words. So there's multiple reasons why they held such strict silence. It wasn't merely, although certainly it was partly because of their contemplative practice, their desire to cultivate this Hezekiah, this inner stillness, but it was much more communal than that as well. So there's so much we can learn from these ancient traditions that I think we too easily dismiss as primitive, but that actually, without the help of modern psychology and all the things we now understand, we're actually getting to the core of what our modern approaches are actually now systematizing on some level, including these amazing programs like the 12-step. So I appreciate your making that connection and glad you're finding that very helpful. Wonderful. Gerald, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning, Father. I'm trying to think of the demonic in terms of our culture, our society. And let me use Afghanistan, since that's current. Was it like a collective demonic that got us in to Afghanistan to begin with? Or the demonic that kept us there for 20 years? Or the demonic that drove us to abandon people that will now, thousands, maybe millions, will suffer because of it? I am comfortable with the individual. And all I can think of is that it's a combination of the demonic of all of us. I don't know. What can you say about that? Sorry.
No, that's a very difficult but great question. I do think we can look at what some have called like the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age or the day as one that carries a kind of collective blindness or a collective denial around one's communal, personal, national history. There is so much, whether I would call, for example, any of those things specifically demonic, may be too direct, but I'm trying to grapple with how I would nuance that. I feel that saying that is demonic is maybe too direct, but to suggest that there are aspects of the decisions that were made by the United States, et cetera, and how to respond to this were marked by a certain blindness or ulterior motives, or hidden agendas, certainly I think fed into what became very poor decisions with after 20 years of war and nearly $2.6 trillion got us virtually nowhere at the end of the day. that there's something profoundly tragic about that, but I'm not convinced we wouldn't remake those same decisions even in the course of our lifetimes. I'm not sure if anything was learned. And it's that blindness, the fueling of nationalism, but it's also, for example, the way in which you cannot get, for example, today, what I think is a fair reading of the Crusades, because it is so hijacked by left or right agendas to use that very complex, difficult, fraught time in medieval history, always being distorted for agendas from Muslim extremists, from Christian white supremacists in this country. Try to find a book that isn't completely distorted by current political ideologies and agendas to make a point. It's very difficult. So all of these sort of things that are half understood, misunderstood, poorly understood trajectories in history kind of get usurped and manipulated for ulterior agendas that are not only individual but national. And I think that's where I see the demonic in the sort of dishonesty and the way in which, and in the ignorance in the way that people cherry pick words or phrases from the past, the Crusades, for example, or the way in which, and we saw how that was getting tossed around back and forth after the attack on New York and Washington and so forth in September 11th. When you really begin to uncover this, you realize that what the sinister element in all of this is what's not being said, or the way in which government or politics or ideological groups are spinning agendas and leading to half-baked, misunderstood approaches that are trying to justify our current action, right? And that's where I see the confusion and the obfuscation of truth and the inability to deal with complexity and trying to make various times in history just a caricature to justify what we're doing, when, and why. All of that is where I see in that confusion what we would call the demonic, that leads then to the decisions that are being made, which have profoundly destructive and unhelpful outcomes. I was studying in Belgium in the late 90s, and I was studying with a Catholic priest named Bashar, and he was an Iraqi Catholic priest, which was a minority there. And he was talking about Desert Storm, and he said, the problem with Desert Storm was that the United States just overflexed their power and drove our, huts to rubble. And it actually had the effect of turning us to a tremendous mistrust of the United States, because it was like, going after a mosquito with a cannonball. He said it was just overdone. And he said to me then his biggest fear with that, in a next step, the United States would take out, I want to say Saddam Hussein. Yeah, Saddam Hussein. And I said to him, but why? At the time, why would you object to this? I said, he's such a tyrant. And he says, because if you remove him and if you execute him or assassinate him, you will open up a Pandora's box of terrorism, because he's the only despotic force right now in that region that's preventing these warring militias from just burgeoning. Well, he was right. And part of me thought, well, how is it that this Catholic priest in graduate school in Leuven, Belgium, could see this coming? And for all of our intelligence, we either ignored it, denied it, or couldn't see it. But here we are. And I always think about him, and I've lost track of him. I have no idea what's come of him. But I just, it's disheartening when you see how those who are making these huge political and military decisions seem not to grasp what even local folks on the ground can see. And I wonder what's in that. Do they see it and ignore it, or are they blind to it? I don't know the answer to that, or maybe something else. So it's a very complex question. but it's a good one.
Thank you. And I think I agree with everything you said. You mentioned how after 20 years and we put close to, I guess, $3 trillion into Afghanistan, and we got nothing out of it. And I guess where my mind went was, isn't that the ultimate act of love? We put everything we could to help those people. And now there's millions of women in Afghanistan who have grown up under an entirely different society and are free and don't know what it is to live under this male-dominated, female submissive culture that, in all probability, that's what's coming, if not a horrible, horrible treatment for alleged wrongdoings or just because this goofball wants to do it. Did we turn our back on a people in a, yeah. I mean, it breaks my heart to think what's going to happen there. I hope it doesn't, but the stories of the women in the family being raped and the husband being forced to watch and then being beheaded are not unique stories. This is a mindset that was present there, and we kept our foot on it. Now, no, as a country, it just cost us. We our piggy bank, say, was empty. But for them, it was freedom. It was for the first time in that society. Now, I'll eat my own words.
So
Maybe this is an impossibility. We have got a tribal society there that, well, one, I don't think we know how to deal with it on a civil basis. And two, I'm not sure they really want to.
So Gerald, first of all, I very much appreciate what you're saying, and I agree we are really in a terrible bind because everything you described about what is coming down the pike, I think is going to happen, is happening. The notion that there's some new and improved version of leadership is I think just bad PR. But let me just say, because I see a bunch of hands still up, I'm going to just leave it at that. I don't know. In short, those kinds of global political questions are relevant to what it means to be a contemplative in the world. But I think we have to begin by starting with our own sense of our own capacity to look in this intense way, in part because then we become voices within our own culture that can speak, not just being caught up in that zeitgeist I was talking about, but really can speak from a place of clarity. And that's part of what I think our contributions can be, as small as that is. But admittedly, you are raising issues that are just far beyond what I could really know how to reasonably respond to. But I'm with you in your sentiments, and it's terrifying.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Nora, please.
Father, thank you, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to bring it back to the personal level here because uh, I want to share just something that I learned from someone in this group, a woman who said, "We are all finding our way home." And I love that that has stayed with me because home is our God, is God. And finding our way is the dealing with the demons and the shadow self. And so to me, to look at a crowd or to look at my congregation and to think we are all finding our way home in our own way. That's what we're doing. Some of us trying to do it with this contemplative practice, but we all are on that journey. And so I want to share that, just that phrase, we are all finding our way home, and home is our God. Thank you.
Yeah, Nora, thank you. Beautifully said. And that's it. And aren't we much better doing that in community than trying to do that in isolation? And maybe there's indeed a link to what Gerald was saying, insofar as, this sort of, J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a devout Catholic and understood these kinds of archetypal realities. He was clearly an astute spiritual person, really builds into his epic narratives this notion that small bands of little people who are committed to one another in deep community and friendship can overcome the worst of society's evils, right? This is really what this epic trilogy of his is about, the capacity for friendship and love. If even the small, most unassuming bunch could in fact be the force that overcomes these maniacal, militarized powers of our world. And perhaps that's the beauty of what it means to do this work of coming home individually, because there is this broader impact that we have in doing so on these larger mechanisms, these structures, and so forth, right? Robin had posted in our a Jungian quote, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a person to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. That profoundly resonates with me. I was teaching at Fordham University on 9/11 and saw firsthand what happened that day. And I could tell you it impacted me for the rest of my life. You can't see that and not be deeply affected on some dark level by staring in the face of that kind of mayhem and destruction and evil. There is absolutely something life-altering. And one of the professors in our sort of processing it in the days following called it an experience of subscendence, the sort of opposite of transcendence, and how forever that could leave a kind of mark. And I can see how it does, but all the more then that we need to be driven to the love of friendship and community to carry us through. And this is what I think church is at its heart, at its best iteration. Thank you, Nora, for sharing that. Christine, please.
Just very quickly, I wanted to share a book that really helped me understand corporate sin. It's called Violence Unveiled by Gil Bailey. And I highly recommend it for everyone. The whole process of scapegoating, Violence Unveiled. Yeah.
Could you give us the author of that?
Gil Bailey, Gilbaille, Gil Bailey.
Great. And it looks at the question of social or corporate collective.
Absolutely. All through history. Incredible book. Life-changing, really.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Christine. Wonderful. Let's see. Okay, Robert, I think you're right after Carmen and Roman, correct? Yeah, okay, very good. So Carmen and Roman or Roman. Hi.
Hi, it's Roman here.
Okay.
And then Carmen. And I'm thinking about Jesus saying, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And it seems to me that he's referring to the parasites that are so well lodged that we're not aware of them. And that if you were to refer...
You accidentally got remuted again.
Sorry, our computer took a spill.
That's okay.
possessed by a demon.
Right.
So, and so the forgive them for they know not what they do seems to me to refer to the parasite demon. And if Christ were to refer to the renegade, he would say, forgive them for they know what they're doing, but they can't stop. They can't help themselves. And I'm just thinking, there's demons, and then there's how to react to these demons. And was Christ saying, and seemed to be his last word on the subject, they can't help it, we can't help it. And I guess I tend to want to have the easy way out for myself. I'm being run by forces that either I can't see or I can't control. And Christ could have said, forgive them for they know not what they're doing, but please teach them to do the examen and teach them about nepsis and awareness. But he kind of left it at, they don't know what they're doing. And I don't think he was just talking about the people who were there crucifying him. He was making, it seems to me, a statement on the whole human condition, that we don't know what we're doing. So I guess my question is, how do we react, or I want to say to myself, forgive me for I know not what I'm doing, and how do we react to other people's demons, which I am always willing to see my own in other people. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Roman. It's a great question. What I find compelling about Jesus's own ministry, in terms of that line you took from Luke's gospel as his last, really, well, almost his last statement from the cross before, into my hands I commend your spirit. What comes to mind is when we look at the Gospel of John chapter 8, of the story of the woman who's accused of adultery, and this is that circle of stoning. That's such a beautiful story. By the way, it's one of the few texts in the New Testament that the church knows is not the original to John. In fact, we don't think that story came about until possibly the 9th to the 12th century. Some believe it was actually originally something Luke would have had in his gospel. The manuscripts are very unclear, and it appears in multiple places throughout various gospels and always fits in awkwardly. It's one of the few stories that the church knows is not original to the author of the gospels, but includes anyway because it's such a powerful and beloved tradition. Any other examples of that have been excised from the books as inauthentic. So it speaks volumes of how compelling this particular narrative is. And has been for the church. But what is compelling to me about it is when he, first of all, he does what his whole life in ministry does in an encapsulated moment. He enters into the circle of judgment and identifies with the judged, which I think is a very important thing, right? He literally puts his life on the line by entering a circle where she's about to be stoned and could have gotten himself stoned with her, right? So here he sides, he identifies with the judged, the one who is being judged. And from that center, from that place, doesn't judge the people who are all grasping their stones ready to throw. He asks them to do an examination of conscience, right? All he says to them is, okay, well, if you yourself don't have sin, then go ahead, you be the first person. Of course, no one could authentically admit to that. And it's their own self-judgment, their own self-examine, to use your term, right? That process of introspection that leads them to the conclusion that I don't have a right to judge this woman. Why? Because I carry with me my own guilt for various things that I know are true about my shortcomings. And that disarms them. But Jesus never says, I condemn you all the way you're condemning her. He never says, I'm doing to you what you do to her. He simply asks them to acknowledge, right, the hypocrisy. And they do the work because they all walk away. And the beautiful sort of subsequent moment is that he then says to her, is there no one to judge you? No, sir, no one's left to judge me. And the beautiful, here you see that real identification of the divine who comes out to greet us as we are in the moment. Then neither do I judge you. The one who had the right to judge didn't. And that divine refraining from judgment is the place from which his next sort of admonishment can come with real authenticity. Now go back to your life and don't do that anymore. Not because I'm judging you, but because it's beneath your dignity. And the beauty of how that moment transforms both the accusers and the accused and restores balance without judgment, but by getting each of us to look deep in our hearts. I was at a monastery here in Big Sur, the New Kamaldalis monastery some years ago, and happened to be there at a time when students from GTU, from Loyola Marymount in LA were there, and met a student who was much older than an undergraduate. He was probably in his early 30s. And he asked me to go for a walk on these trails in these mountains. I said, sure, And in the middle of that, we were talking about our lives, and I said, well, how about you? What about your life? And he said, well, I was in jail for 20 years. And I said, my God, that's terrible. What was that for? And he said, well, for murder. And I was a little bit taken aback, given that I was alone in the woods with him at that moment. And to be honest, it gave me a little bit of a creepy feeling. And I kind of just stood and waited for more. And he basically said, after 20 years, because of DNA testing, they were able to prove his innocence. And he went in at age 19. Right. So you can imagine the loss of the best years of his life to a false accusation. He was Hispanic. And while he was in the jail, in prison, he refused to succumb to getting associated with a gang and dealing with drugs. And he got his education, and he really worked his way through that, and finally was exonerated. And after he got out of prison, he went to Loyola Marymount and went to the president and said, here's what happened to me. I've been thrown in jail unjustly for 20 years, and I want an education, and I want it for free. And the president said, you got it. And so he went on. He's now getting involved politically as in sort of various political positions, and mostly in Southern California, where he's really advocating for an end to the death penalty. But he has beautiful artwork which expresses these people in chains, right, unjustly, because this is sort of a way he's dealing with what happened to him. But during our conversation, he pulled out a stone, and he says, I have carried this with me since the day I got out of jail, and I hope that by the time I die, I've sort of whittled it down to just a little pebble. But he said, I carry this because it reminds me that every day I'm holding it, that I haven't thrown it at anyone, that I haven't judged, that I'm not living out of a place of anger or judgment, even though I was judged by society wrongly for 20 years and paid a terrible price for that. I don't want a life where I become the judge, right? So he says, this stone reminds me that I have to do my inner work and not cast it at others. He's a profoundly, deeply spiritual man who could be incredibly embittered, and he's not. And I don't know where he necessarily finds that inner strength, given what was taken from him. But he's a profound individual and real example of what it means to embody this journey, and having somebody who does that real inner work.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. Carmen, was there a question you had then, or can I put your hand down?
I had wanted to say
Oh,
something.
Sure, go right ahead.
Just for questions or to share? Is it just
Sure.
for questions? Okay to share?
Oh, sure.
So thank you for that. I would love to know this person's name, if at all possible.
Yes, I have to think of his last name. His first name is Fred. I can find out for you, Carmen, and I'll send him. He's all over YouTube.
Whenever that came after, but I really would love to know. So to me, what you're talking about, piggybacking on Romans, is the gift of Jesus's non-judgment could allow the admonishment, if one can accept it, out of dignity that leads to healing. It's not condoning behavior. It's the gift of joining, and not over-identifying or enabling, to use that 12-step language or Al-Anon. And this reminds me of, I have a nun sister friend out of Rome, And recently she spoke, a Centering Prayer Soul, who spoke about when she was in, I can't remember which country, in one of her ministries. It was very tiny, primitive, tribal. And when she was witnessing people be killed on the doorstep, no education at all available, it was understandable to her. Her deep pain came when she went back to Europe. And I think it was the first school slaying. It was either Columbine or Sandy Hook. And she had always thought that as a teaching sister, healing through teaching, education was everything. And that our educational system would prevent these sorts of things, even though historically. But it broke through her delusion and her fantasy about our superiority and our ethnocentrism of various kinds through colonialism with our education, that it could prevent our demons from coming forth. And she went into a very deep depression, not from being over there and literally witnessing it repeatedly on her literal doorstep, but here when we're thought to grow better, know better, do better. And that takes me back from the gift of this chapter and of our own personal work and our next step and your example when you were speaking to Gerald about, yes, Afghanistan is huge and beyond, but what can we do? And it reminds me recently of someone said, if you really care about the women in Afghanistan, they were talking to a group of men, perhaps listen to your wives. They might be a resource. Start here. But in general, and that goes for us too, any of us, right? Listen to everyone. So thank you. This chapter is extraordinary. I look forward to more unpacking. Super thanks. And I'll look forward to the name. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carmen. Yeah, beautiful comments. I can very much understand the depression your friend would have gone into, being someone who is as vocationally a teacher at heart, right? And then to see, I remember after Sandy Hook, I experienced a similar just absolute dismay. It took a long time to sort of move past the depression around that, because you can't look at that and not feel absolute, darkness around, the epitome of innocence in a place that should be the safest of all, becoming such a dark, horrific sort of outcome. So I'm with you on that. I think that one of the things we see in society, and this is maybe addressing something a number of you have talked about, what I've come to realize is that philosophically, at least speaking, as these things play out ideologically in this country, it seems to me that conservative worldviews look to the question of a moral society by saying that you can't have a moral society if you don't have individuals acting morally. And so this is why conservatives were all up in arms around what happened, say, with Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. How can the president, who is supposed to be the leader of the country, have such low moral judgment around this sort of issue and still be regarded as, someone who we keep in office, for example, right? So that individual behavior becomes important. And with that, a certain agenda around what is regarded as moral and immoral, which of course is highly debatable. But nevertheless, the notion, I think, is a moral society is constituted by individuals who live moral lives. I think more progressive, if you want to call it liberal ideologies around what makes a moral society, it's a society that protects its most vulnerable, right? That acts collectively to care for those who are most marginalized and so forth. So that plays out in terms of whether or not you give government so-called handouts or not, right? And all of these kinds of questions around, well, how can you have a moral society if you're condoning marriage equality because you're condoning a sinful state of being, as opposed to, well, how can you have a moral society that doesn't protect its gay and lesbian members and continues to marginalize? So you see how that basic thought gets played out in various iterations. What I find interesting is how in the story that I mentioned from John 8, both of those philosophies somewhat are brought into play, whereby Jesus first says to the group, look, this is an individual woman. She is vulnerable in your society, right? And so forth. You are judging her for something as if you have a right to do so. So he's challenging that notion that somehow it's okay to attack an individual, but rather he's saying you have to protect her from this, right? And then says to her personally, now don't do that anymore. So there's that summons to an individual life of moral stature. And you can see in that narrative, both of those tensions being played out with this beautiful kind of precision. Of course, it doesn't solve the problem because we're still debating on what makes for an individual moral life and what constitutes, right, those things. But nevertheless, I think that, when we look to these larger questions of how geopolitical, wars are being played out, how gun control laws or the lack thereof are being played out, some of the best things we can do is to continue to go deeper, right? So that we can really interrogate, where am I in the midst of this? And how can I simply not get caught up in one ideological battle or another, but really be present to the complexities and the nuances of truth in it all? And it's difficult, but indeed we start with ourselves. Yeah. So thank you, Carmen, for those comments.
Grateful, thank you.
Of course. And Robert, please.
Full of gratitude, first of all, to you, because today's session represents 2 years since you started holding our hands. And, I am so looking forward to the next 2 and 4 and 6 years, however long it takes. I know I'm being blessed every single step of the way. I see here a community of fireflies, as Christine pointed out, that shine incredible light. And that light to me comes back to what Nora was saying. It's guiding me home. And I'm very deeply touched by Father Richard Rohr, who, as we know, is probably not going to be with us for much longer as he enters his final stage of life. And he's just shining like such a beautiful light. And what Father Richard says is that we make progress on the spiritual path for one of two reasons. One, we are attracted by great love, which is when it feels wonderful. But the second way is we're repelled by great pain. And I'm coming to see that pain is as much a gift from God as, this wonderful attractive force. Because when I put my hand on a stove and feel the pain, I am encouraged to remove my hand from that stove, or else it'll end up as a pile of ashes. So to be able to see the pain as a loving gift from God is something that I'm finding is a tremendous blessing. So it's good or it's good, depending on how I see it. So thank you all so much. And Father Vincent, thank you for your sermon yesterday that was posted yesterday. Folks, if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, I cannot tell you what you are missing. Father Vincent's sermon of yesterday. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just a quick word. So just a couple of things. First of all, Robert, thank you for those beautiful comments. You're spot on, I think, in so much of what you're sharing. And I love your analogy of the pain as a way of teaching us and protecting us on some level. C.S. Lewis had that beautiful image of the Michelangelo pounding away at the block of marble, and how he says, to the marble, that was pain, and that was, why are you doing this to me? But yet what he was revealing is the Pietà, for example, and the beautiful notion that the Pietà is not something he created by adding, but he simply took away and emerged what in fact was already there, right? And that's how he comes to these beautiful sculptures. But you could imagine the marble under the weight of the chisel sort of complaining about the pain, and yet what's getting etched out is this beautiful image that emerges from what was previously just a sort of if you'll say, a hunk of marble without really any particular artistic form. So, that when you talked about this notion of the pain as this gift, I that comes to mind. A couple of quick things I'm posting now. Yes, that is him. Thank you, Brother Will, for finding the name. It was Frankie Carrillo is the name of the gentleman I met in Big Sur, and I would encourage you to look up his life. He's a beautiful, beautiful person. Now I think he's actually a father of 2 children, and wonderful thing. The sermon actually that Robert is talking about was actually one that I gave several weeks ago on Transfiguration Sunday, and it was trying to help people move toward an openness and understanding of what it means to receive the trans community and that trans identity. And I know people struggle with that. So I was kind of using that for that. The reason it's delayed is because I've had this nagging cough and I haven't been able to record my sermons without coughing through them. So I got through one yesterday, but I'm 3 behind. I'm 3 weeks behind posting my sermons. So those will come as I get my my chest cleared up here. If you go to vincentpizzuto.org, you can find that blog post right there. So thank you, Robert, for that shout out. I'm glad you appreciated that presentation. Nicola, please.
Well, I'm glad you've addressed your cough because I've been worrying about it and I didn't want to bring it up, but is it improving?
It is gradually improving. The truth be told, I think it would have been gone a long time ago if I were sleeping better and working less. I think it's just lingering because I'm pushing myself. But it isn't, it's just a simple viral thing that we all get, and it's just inflamed the bronchial tube. So when I talk, it makes it worse. If I just shut up, it tends to diminish the coughing, but in my field, that's hard to do. So, but thank you for the concern. Yeah, it's nothing dangerous. It's just lingering.
Well, I worry that you burn yourself out, so I must express that. But what I wanted to speak to was the sermon that you posted yesterday by Luke on the Transfiguration. And I just would like to commend you for your courage and your vulnerability. It was a beautiful modeling for all of us. And I hope your congregation got that. I mean, it was just very, very powerful. And I just am very grateful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. I from the responses from the parish, it was well received. I don't know if folks didn't like it and didn't say anything, but my sense is that, knowing my congregation, my flock as I do, I think they were very receptive. I was, trying to help people who feel I don't understand this whole concept. So how, and then feel guilty about that. So I try to segregate understanding from compassionate acceptance and really helping people to just be comfortable with the questions they may have around issues of trans identity while still embracing a kind of open, compassionate response. And I think, again, my flock is such that I think it, for the most part, people found that very helpful as a way of framing the issue. So thank you for that.
So it's back to the stoning of the woman.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. Thank you. So maybe given the time we have left, this would be good to move toward both what will be our practice for the coming week, and then also a little bit of time to discuss whether you had participated or want to share anything from our practice for this week. So for today, I'm asking you this week to look at a renegade demon, as it were. Sorry, I didn't put the other quote marks after demon. Even if it is one that you do, sorry, again, typo, do not wish to share with the group. So I want you to be very honest and authentic in this assessment. And even if you're not yet comfortable sharing it with this group, to look at what you might think of as a renegade demon. And the real issue there is to ask, what unhealed psychological wound, emotional trauma, or addictive tendencies gives it life in you? That's really the key, to use that as a way to light the way to our sense of woundedness, that's giving it life. And so as you enter this particular place of woundedness, I want you to just to observe what begins to shift in you and in your relationship with this so-called demon. And I'm just going to scroll through here while you jot that down. I'm hearing feedback, so I'm wondering if somebody's unmuted that I could. Okay. Okay, let me then move into last week's practice. Put that there. So what I asked for folks, this is actually 2 weeks ago, as some of you know, I was giving a retreat this time last week. So I'm inviting you in this case to practice body prayer. Consider when you pray very intentionally making the sign of the cross, or perhaps another gesture that brings you to that place of centeredness, something that gets expressed bodily. I invited you to repeat it slowly, intentionally, deliberately, and ask what it says to you, how it impacts you, how you feel when you pray this way. So I'm using this as a way of trying to encourage a more intimate way of understanding the body as participatory in our prayer, and not something you just have to get out of the way in order to pray. And don't know if any of you took me up on that practice challenge, but if so, you have the floor. I would love to hear what your experience was. David, go right ahead.
Thank you. I'm fairly new to the group. I'm playing catch up with the book. Almost finished with chapter 2, but I think there are a couple gestures. The one is making the sign of the cross. And as I think about it, it's really rooted in my baptism, and as a pastor in those moments when I baptize and I make the sign of the cross and say you've been sealed by the Spirit, Holy Spirit, and you've been sealed by the Spirit in Christ forever, and nothing can ever separate you from God. And so I think that's when I make the sign of the cross, it's a reminder of my baptism, that I belong to Christ. And another part of that is I lead some Zoom groups, and offering a benediction, I often can see in the eyes of the people when I offer that, I can see those who also make the sign of the cross, that there's something deep within in them when I make the sign of the cross and they respond. So that's what I would say about the sign of the cross. The other one is the gesture of lifting your hands in prayer. I remember being a little boy. I was a preacher's kid, and standing on my bed in the bedroom I shared with my twin, and many times just standing there as a little boy and lifting my hands and singing improvised melodies and words, just that kind of moment of praise. And so I could say a little bit more about it, but there are others who would want to share. So I'll just say those two gestures, the sign of the cross and hands uplifted in prayer.
Thank you, David. The hands uplifted gesture is called the orans, O-R-E-N-S. And that orans position is one of the most ancient forms of bodily postures that Christians took standing in prayer. And of course, does to some degree mimic the sign of the cross. In some ways, unfortunately, that posture has sort of been reduced to only the priest using that during the prayer of the Eucharist and so on. Although in many congregations, you see a restoration of that, even in a minimized form during the Our Father, for example. It's a very, very ancient posture and a beautiful sort of one of openness, right, and of joy, actually. And like you, the sign of the cross is so deeply embedded. I find myself often making the sign of the cross over things throughout the whole day, just in subtle gestures as a sign of blessing or gratitude or thankfulness. And what you find is that very often what the body can convey through a simple gesture can carry 1,000 words or 1,000 pages of prayers that all get sort of, if you want to say, compressed into this one simple gesture that just becomes the expression for everything you want to say or do around your gratitude and love and blessing and so on. So it's beautiful. So thank you for sharing that. Both of those are quite ancient in the Christian tradition. Let's see. That brings us to Mary, please.
Although I really find it meaningful to receive a blessing from someone with the sign of the cross and all. I think I'm in a phase of my spiritual growth where I went through decades with a lot of ritual with the Catholic Church and all. And what I came away with, maybe not others, was, oh, to be close to God, you need to be in the building, in the church. To be close to God, you need to receive communion. That sign of the cross before and after prayer is almost like you're picking up the phone, now you're hanging it up. And my growth in the past couple years has barely been focusing on and understanding in a deeper way my personal relationship with God, and that it is every second of my life. And so it's not just at certain times when I do certain things or I'm in certain places. So for this phase, to me, it's not helpful to have those kinds of signs. There might be another phase where it is, but I just know for me right now, where I'm trying to really understand on a deeper level what this relationship is, and it is constant, and it is close because it is within me. It's not separate from me. So just a different take on it.
Yeah, beautifully said, Mary. And I appreciate sort of how that's developing within your own sort of spiritual context. I am aware I'm going to have to close at 8:59 sharp because we have another group coming in, and I see the hands up. So Francis, I'm going to end with you, and I may just try to hold off my comments to try to give you all a little bit more time, and then try to see if I might be able to offer something summative. So I think that brings us to Mary Sue. Please, we'll go with you next.
Thank you. And thanks for everything. I'll try to be brief. One of the things that occurs to me, I have been participating in the Center for Action and Contemplation's Wisdom Schools with Cynthia Bourgeau. And the importance of embodiment is probably one of the biggest takeaways for me in my own spiritual journey. And so integrated with the teachings, which are very heady sometimes, are really embodied prayer practices with all kinds of gestures and movements, chanting as part of that. And what I have found is it has had a profound effect on helping me to integrate what I'm learning, but also brings me to a deeper place. So it becomes part of it just grounds me in a way that's even hard to put into words. And so I just wanted to say, it doesn't have to be anything specific, but just how important embodiment is. And she makes the point too, as a Western culture, we tend not to do that.
Right.
And so I just want to, that's it. That's all I want to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Sue. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I'll try to respond briefly after we've heard from our other participants. Thank you. It's well said. Let's see. That brings us then to Carmen and Roman.
Hi, just want to thank you so much for that background on the position. Orens.
Orens, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Appreciate it. You know, like you being here at 9/11 and my late husband connected and eventually passing from it. It's interesting. He'd done yoga, but he was doing it as part of his body prayer, even in the hospital. And, you know, his blinding, crippling, the world was upside down because of the vestibular system. He ended up burning up from the toxicity. But he would continually, the whole 23 months, well, much longer, they missed in diagnoses, and nobody was thinking about these kinds of things going into the bodies and what they do, or in that way. But he would continually return to that position. And when he couldn't speak for many, about 16 of the month, it had burned up the inside. Anyway, he kept doing that. And it was different than a yoga posture or a dance, second position. And thank you for that. It just gave me chills to hear that and to know how he was embodily communicating and connecting with God. in that way. So thank you. I did not know that background. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you, Carmen. Beautifully said. And I'm sorry for your loss. Mhm.
We walk together. All
Indeed.
those.
Indeed. Let's see, Robin. Hi, good morning.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to share how wonderful it is to take my gestures of sacredness and give them the extra attention which you have encouraged us to do. And I was so pleased when I first met you that we had this gesture, which you bring to so many of our venues. And I tend also to sit cross-legged because, and these both come from a 40-year-old, 50-year-old time I had in India. But for me, it doesn't matter what the gesture is, it matters what I bring to it. And the fact that I have things that I've repeated over and over and over again through the years makes them so deeply ingrained that when I sit cross-legged, I automatically, my body takes me to a place. And then with your suggestion, I added my consciousness to it for this time, and it's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, Robin, thank you for that. That's wonderful. And I know that you draw from a number of spiritual trajectories and paths, and you can see how in each of them, I think there are these overlaps of how we embody this. It's quite beautiful how the body unifies the differences even in teaching at times. Thanks. Good to hear from you, Robin. And finally, Francis, please. Good to see you.
Hi. This isn't actually one that I do. It's one that I received. And that is when I was a child, my mother used to always do the sign of the cross on my forehead, like you do when you receive ashes.
Right.
And she would also kiss us on the forehead. And I find if I get kissed on the forehead or the sign of the cross on my forehead, that I feel loved. It just takes me bodily to a feeling of feeling loved. So that's what happens when you give me ashes. It's amazing that those little things become viscerally incorporated into our nervous systems.
Absolutely, like body memory, really. I mean, it's something very profound, how these things get in our bones, and we don't. One of you just commented how we've lost that in our culture, a sense of really how to be in our body. And one of the things I perpetually try to inculcate in my congregation, many of whom have returned to church after many years and don't necessarily have the natural know-how or how to be liturgic, how to be bodily in the liturgy, is, I even gave a list of sermons of them long before COVID, trying to help people. This is why we do the sign of the cross. This is when we bow and why. This is why we do these things, not as a demand, but as trying to teach the language of bodily prayer and to give people the freedom to know that it's okay to experiment with this. So it's a very beautiful thing when we begin to feel that and we realize this is a fully engaged sacramental type of thing that we're dealing with, right? So thanks. I will know now to bless you on your forehead much more often, Francis. Thank you for that. Okay, very quickly, because we literally have 30 seconds, Carmen, or else the next group will be in here. Go right ahead. Or was that Roman?
My hand down. I'll ask next time.
Okay, could you just hold that thought then? Okay, because they're going to boot me out. Okay, so speaking of signs of the cross and bodily prayer, go with my blessing in the peace of Christ, the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. Have a lovely week and a beautiful journey ahead. And I look forward to seeing you all next Saturday. God bless you now.